Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Borderline Podcast with me, your host, Andrew Willix. Tonight, guys, I've got another stellar guest who's kindly offered to come into the podcast. Jill Sitnick is our guest this evening. Now, Jill is a PTSD survivor who's here to demystify and destigmatize psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Now, I know this is going to be new to a lot of you, and I'm sure you're going to be blown away by the data that backs up everything that Jill covers during this very special episode. And I'm not going to leave you guys waiting any longer. I know I've hyped this one up for a couple of days now, so please enjoy, and here's the amazing Jill Sitnick. Thanks.
Jill, thank you so much for coming on the Borderline Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you to share your knowledge and your story. Like I spoke to you about before we start recording, this is going to be incredibly new information for a lot of people. It's going to be a great learning curve for a lot of people, and hopefully it'll open up a lot of doors and ideas in people's thoughts. So, just what's all available out there. So, without further ado, Jill, could you just then tell us a little bit of your backstory, why your university process past, and what you're going to share with us tonight?
Well, so Andrew, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you taking the time. I talk about MDMA therapy for PTSD, and for those who are saying MDMA, what's that? That is actually a psychedelic. So technically I talk about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy that in the States is supposed to be FDA approved coming this August. So Australia has already approved this therapy. The US is looking to do so. Canada is also very active. And I think the globe is looking at what the US is going to do before a lot of other countries move forward. So I think that's why our paths crossed a little bit to kind of talk about maybe the future of things. Ultimately, I share my story of childhood trauma-induced PTSD that I was not diagnosed with until my late 40s, and what MDMA therapy is, since it's a medical procedure, to help people understand this relatively new healing modality. So that's me in a minute to just kind of give folks an overview of who I am.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, if you don't mind, could we maybe take the story to the start?
Yep.
And just kind of go through. It's a long period, instead of 4 years, but there's obviously gaps to fill in there. If you could fill the gaps as much as you can, and just in your own time.
Yeah. So to give people an idea, I grew up with parents who were not equipped to be parents. My father was kind of psychopathic narcissist, liked to beat up my mother and myself, lots of verbal abuse. My mother, unfortunately, was clinically depressed her entire life. She came into the marriage depressed, and that continued. And she attempted suicide multiple times throughout her life. The watershed moment was when I was 5. My mother, in trying to escape my father, I've now learned that, when I was 5, she actually tried to commit suicide via a shotgun. She survived a shotgun wound to the belly, but that then created a little bit of a respite from the abuse from my father, but quite a bit of not knowing where I was going to live. I was living with relatives and things of that sort. A lot of disruption throughout my childhood. Throughout the rest of my childhood, at one point, my father threw me out of his house. At one point, my mother threw me out of her house. I went to college for 1 year. I came back. My father thought he was going to be able to start hitting me again. I got out on my own, and I wound up meeting a lovely man, my partner, Carl, and I was with him for over 20 years. And what I have learned is that I never dealt with my childhood stuff, primarily because that relationship, that loving relationship with Carl, regulated my nervous system. I was always an anxious girl. I was always a type A workaholic. I just thought that was me. I never connected it to my childhood. Well, unfortunately, Carl passed away. And about 18 months after he passed away, when the widow's fog was starting to dissipate, I got a work email that, I mean, this is the craziest part. I got a work email that was a level 1 in terms of issue. But for me, it was just a trigger. And I was just 100% sure I was going to lose my job, never be able to get another job, lose my house, be living on the streets. Like, I just had this overwhelming sense that bad things were going to happen with very little prompting. It was a silly work email. And ultimately, I went back to after months of me being in this hyper vigilant, what's going to happen, bad things are going to happen, and I'm not prepared. I went to my therapist who had helped me with my grief work because I had treated myself to a therapist to help me with the grief work. And after months of talking to her, she's the one who diagnosed me with PTSD, that my physical responses were a response from my childhood trauma, which was a surprise to me. She was in a program to become a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist. She told me to go look at the clinical trial data that's at maps.org, maps.org, because those folks ran the clinical trials. And very long story short, I agreed to the therapy to work with her and her mentor, who was a medical doctor at the time. And 1 year, 3 therapeutic journeys or 3 therapeutic psychedelic procedures. I then no longer qualified for that PTSD diagnosis. I was not suicidal, and I was able to carry on. I had healed the capital T traumas. I was able then to continue on and heal the lowercase T traumas. And so, yeah, there you go. That's a whole lot of information there. I'm sure I've created a lot of questions.
Yeah, you have. Well, thank you for being so open-handed about your story, which is tragic.
Yeah.
But very optimistic that you're sat smiling with today's story. I've got my words mixed up there. So obviously there's a long period of gap. Were you on any kind of what I'm going to describe as conventional treatments before you started looking at the psychedelic approach, or was that just, here's something new and maybe this will work?
I think so. I'm Generation X. I'm a child of the 80s. I did not know, in my mind, other people had way worse childhoods than I did. At least I had food. I had some housing insecurity. I had a little bit of food insecurity, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, there was always a roof over my head. There were always clothes. There was food. It wasn't great sometimes, but whatever. And so I think in my head, I knew my childhood was different, but I don't think I realized how much trauma I was carrying in my body. I should say I did not know that. And so throughout my adulthood, again, in that lovely relationship with Carl, who regulated my nervous system, it never even occurred to me that my hyperactivity was really vigilance from childhood abuse. I didn't know that. I didn't have any sort of intervention. I'm using the word intervention until after Carl passed. I had treated myself to therapy because with grief, it was the first time I had experienced grief, and it was vicious. And so that was the first time. At one point, I think like 6 months after his passing, I went on Wellbutrin, which is antidepressant, because what I did not know was that the PTSD symptoms were actually starting. My therapist and I thought it was just kind of part of the grieving process. So I was maybe on Wellbutrin for 6 to 8 months. I had to get off of Wellbutrin before doing the psychedelic journeys, but that's really the only intervention that I had in terms of mental health.
So you're offered this therapy, which very little people in the UK is going to know about. Could you just,
Sure,
from the start of that, just tell us how does a psychedelic therapy work? How do you take it? What do you do? And the floor is yours.
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand, and also makes it much easier to understand, when you think of a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy session as any other medical procedure. So if you're going into a doctor's office or a hospital for any sort of procedure, you have to prep for it in some way. You probably can't eat the night before. You may have had to go to multiple doctor's appointments to kind of figure out what's going on. Then that day you have the procedure, and then the time period after that procedure is the healing time. Maybe you have to go to physical therapy. Maybe you have to make sure that, you walk on that brand new knee a certain number of minutes a day, like whatever the instructions are after the procedure. That process is the same for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So I like to think, I was an English major, so I take math, like, let's make math really easy. Think of the preparation as 40%, the actual psychedelic day, the procedure, and I say day because psychedelic days can, with MDMA and psilocybin or magic mushrooms, those days can last anywhere from 5 to 8 hours. That's why I'm saying day. So you have the procedure, and then you have what's called integration, which is the work afterward when you start to reframe your memories and your beliefs. In terms of the actual psychedelic, what most people kind of ask me is like, well, what was that day actually like? Well, after the months of prep, myself, my therapist, and my guide, who was a medical doctor at the time, so I know I had medical grade MDMA. The street name for MDMA is ecstasy or Molly, and sometimes, unfortunately, those street drugs are cut with things that they shouldn't be cut from. I knew I had straight medical grade MDMA. And for me, it was just going to this place, this lovely decorated place with multiple seating areas and a mattress and lots of blankets. And it was nice and warm. I'm always cold, so it was nice and warm. And after sitting and talking to my therapist and guide, we made sure I knew what my intentions were, what my goals were for the session. I took the 2 MDMA capsules, and the day was off to the races. And that's pretty much the same procedure for all 3 journeys.
Hey, I've got to ask there. Were you nervous beforehand?
Oh gosh, I was not a. When my therapist first offered this to me, I said no. The only thing that had gotten me through my childhood was my brain, and the idea of. Remember, I don't know if you had these commercials in the UK. In the US, we had these horrible commercials of the egg in the frying pan. This is your brain on drugs. That was the propaganda. Okay. So that's what we had, this frying egg in this frying pan. And that's what drugs were. And I was like, I'm not going to mess with my brain. I had only smoked marijuana once. I had done ecstasy once, kind of by accident, not really knowing what I was doing. And so the idea of taking drugs, when I actually agreed to the therapy, the time that I agreed to the therapy and the actual day was 4 months. We spent a lot of time going through what I wanted to heal, but also every single question, is it going to make me throw up? Am I going to go crazy afterwards? Am I going to get addicted? Like all of these questions that everybody has, I had those same questions and all of them were answered. It's not addictive. As long as you're screened properly and don't have schizophrenia or a mania or a heart issue, because it is a stimulant, you're fine. I was screened my health way. I was promised that if I do throw up, I'll be taken care of. MDMA is taken at raves and parties every single weekend. That's not what it does to you. So for me, it was just getting all of those questions answered. And I was very nervous because you just don't know what things are like. And that first journey, I actually shut that journey down like at hour 5. Like I was like, my inner children have had enough. And it wasn't until literally an hour and a half after that first day when I started to feel the therapy working that I was like, oh, this works. We can do this again.
That's obviously one of the major problems in the UK when we talk about therapies like that is that there's a very anxiety-inducing effect to the therapy because it's so misunderstood and researched from our side. So thanks a lot for that. So obviously you talked about you're a little bit fearful, a little bit nervous. How was that journey? It was obviously quite short, but very effective, I'm assuming. Could you just tell us about that first time?
Tremendous. Yeah, I mean, it's weird to say that a 5-hour procedure is short, but it was comparatively. My other journeys easily went 7-8 hours. So I think your question was, what was it like? MDMA is a psychedelic. People actually argue whether it should be called a psychedelic or not, because MDMA does not produce the visuals. You're completely coherent. We recorded, my doctor and therapist, we recorded on my phone, except for the second one. There was a tech glitch on that one, but we recorded. So I actually have the transcript of me going through the journey. I don't sound drugged. I don't slur my words. The only thing I didn't do was I didn't lie. Like my entire life, I had kind of little white lies about my background and my history. None of that came out in the journey. It was like I either just told the truth or I didn't talk. I think what's interesting is that for the very first time, I heard my inner voice. And there are some people out there that are like, are you kidding me? You've never heard your inner voice? And then there's other people like me before this therapy have been like, what are you talking about? You have an inner voice? What's that about? And so for the first time, I kind of heard my inner intuition, and that was fascinating. And then the second thing I think that really applies in terms of the healing modality for this therapy is that for the first time, my body calmed down enough. And for people who are just listening, I'm putting my hands on my shoulders because I feel like my entire life, my shoulders were at my ears. MDMA for trauma calms the body's fight and flight response. And so for the first time, I felt comfortable saying to two people in the room that I knew for a fact that if my father was in the room, he'd be trying to kill me with his hands around my neck. And that, like, that's how much I was scared of him. That's how much I knew. I never would have said that to anybody in real life. It would have been too scary and frightening. But I found myself in this journey being so when I listen to the transcripts, it's like almost a little embarrassing because I'm so adamant trying to explain to two people just how much my father wanted me dead. And obviously that is not the case. That was just the fear from a toddler being beaten, kind of ingrained. But those were the two big ones. I was finally able to talk about the most scariest thing to me. And I was able to hear my inner voice. That's what the therapy was like while going through it.
Yeah, I think it's something you touched on there was little white lies, and because something I think about with just talk therapy, taking the UK again, is right now the service that we can get in actual therapy just now, and a lot of that's privatized too. But
Yeah.
talk therapy is only as effective as you can make it, because if you don't let everything out, you're suppressing that inner voice once more, and that is so negative. So to have that allowance, that acceptance to be able to talk openly as you can must have been life changing for you. And I'd say thanks again for sharing that so honestly. Would there be, PTSD has been around for a long time. So could you just explain why MDMA psychedelic therapies would be more effective than the textbooks that we've been using for years gone past?
Well, in the United States, depending on the source that you look in, there's two sources, so I'm not exactly sure which one is right, but on average, they say that 10 to 17 veterans a day in the US attempt suicide due to PTSD. And so when you hear that kind of statistic, it makes it clear that the regular protocol, primarily talk therapy that we have, is not doing a good enough job. It's not fast enough. Maybe there aren't enough practitioners. There's probably 10 or 15 reasons why the current healing modality for PTSD is not working at the level that it should be working. This particular therapy what's interesting is that a lot of different psychedelics are being clinically tested right now for PTSD healing. So you're going to hear a lot about psilocybin or magic mushrooms and the research there. You're going to hear about bufo or 5-MeO-DMT. Those are the same things. You're going to hear a lot of this can cure PTSD or this can heal PTSD. And a lot of them can, depending upon the type of PTSD that you have. So I'm very, very clear in my book and my story that I talk about these 3 therapeutic journeys healed my PTSD symptoms. I was no longer suicidal. I thought I had a future, and, I wasn't afraid that the universe was going to come after me. But I still had a lot of other trauma to deal with. So in that instance where you've kind of been marinated in trauma, MDMA is super helpful because it calms your system down. And for people who've been scared their whole life, that calming of the body is it's a new feeling. It's incredibly helpful to start processing things. You're going to hear other medications like psilocybin or 5-MeO also healing PTSD. as a lot of those situations, you have folks that they've been in like a horrible accident, they've been attacked, they've been in the battlefield. Like they weren't necessarily marinated in abuse, they had this traumatic experience or experiences, and those kind of therapies help that. I'm not in any way, shape, or form discounting that. For me, as someone who you could classify as having complex PTSD, my nervous system was just so dysregulated. MDMA was the right choice for me, thank goodness.
Yeah, and they said there was 3 sessions that you had to do, wasn't there? Yeah,
3.
so
And that's the I align to the clinical trials.
yeah, and I mean, who gets better after 3 sessions of talk therapy? Is obviously what I'm trying to say there. So it's something that it's proven to be working.
Yeah.
Is there would there be any side effects? You spoke about, obviously, it is a stimulant. Schizophrenia obviously would be a big no-no. For any
Yes.
adding any potential hallucinogens. But other than that, is there any core side effects? Because I mean, I've been on a whole list of SSRIs, and every single one that I've had have made me feel terrible at the start. They make you question how effective they are, and when you come off of them, they make you feel even worse. So, is there anything like that with the MDMA style treatments?
No, and what's really interesting is that people are kind of surprised when I say 3 sessions. My first session was September, my second session was December, my third session was May. So it's not like I was popping an MDMA pill for a year. It was literally 6 pills, 2 pills per session, 3 times. You do have a little bit of an MDMA hangover the next day because you're releasing a ton of serotonin in the brain. You'll hear partiers and ravers talk about, the next day hangover. You can take a variety of supplements to really make that next day much less uncomfortable. On the other side, there is a little bit of a use for that hangover because with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, not immediately jumping into your life's responsibility is very, very helpful for healing. So the laying around, just eating soup, hydrating that next day is super helpful. And I would actually encourage people to kind of set at least 3 to 5 days after the journey to really hone in and focus on their stuff. So the idea of kind of lazing around and being lazy is good. But, other than that, it is a stimulant, so you do have to pay attention to your heart. You do get dehydrated. I was allowed to drink my water bottle the entire time. Sometimes you've got some temperature changes, but that could also be me. I was perimenopausal, so who knows? But yeah, I mean, people who are super concerned that this is a really dangerous drug are completely ignoring the fact that kids are doing it every single weekend.
Yeah, I mean, you can't sum it up better than that. We get doing it every weekend, and there is clinical medicinal studies being researched to show their effectiveness in treating mental health conditions.
Yeah.
Why are we still in a position in 2024 that there is still this generational acceptance? Not that they just don't accept that these things can't be possible, because like I said, the old American commercial of the fried eggs in the frying pan. It's surely got to stay in your brain. Was there any fear that you had that once you've done this treatment, did you be open about it and talk openly about it, is what I'm trying to ask there, or did you feel that there might be stigmas attached to that?
Well, actually, because it's funny you asked that question, because so coming out of my third journey, there was a lot of work done at that third journey. And unlike the other 2, where a lot of the shifting happened after the journeys, that third journey, there was actually shifting during that journey. And I was aware that it was happening. We added a little bit of psilocybin to the MDMA journey, and it was transformational. When I was coming out of that enhanced state and I was talking to my guide and therapist, I was so profoundly amazed by the work that had just been done. My doctor and therapist had freed me, my inner subconscious, from my childhood home. The reason I was so scared is that subconsciously I felt like I was still living in that house where my father was beating us up and my mother was like attempting suicide. Like, it was phenomenal, right? So I'm coming out of that enhanced state, and I said to them, people need to understand what this therapy is and how it works, because I went into it primarily because I really trusted my therapist and I saw the clinical trials, but I didn't have an understanding of how it worked until as I was going through it. And so I was a corporate girl. I worked for Microsoft at the time. And I said, Jill is not going to go listen to someone who has way too much neon tie-dye and talks kind of like the person at the dinner party that you think is just a little bit weird, right? You want to get a little distance. Like, I would not pay attention to that person, but I would pay attention to another Jill. I would pay attention to another corporate girl who's got her life together, who's like, hey, look, this can really work. And so that's basically what I did. It didn't really matter to me that there was a stigma, because I started my career way back in the day as a teacher. And so the idea of teaching people about this healing modality, and whether I get judged about it or not, whatever, like, it's worth it. It's way more important, even just where we are now without having it FDA approved, and the number of people that I've helped and they've been able to see that there's a possibility of healing. Like, that's why I'm doing it. I can handle the snickers. And here's what winds up happening. People hear about it and they snicker. And then like 10 minutes later, they come back and they're like, well, tell me more about that. So that tells me I'm on the right track.
Yeah, we're curious people, and we just don't like that. That's not our problem.
Yep.
Your first journey, then you added a little bit of psilocybin into it. Could you
Third.
just could you just outline the differences between what would be a purely MDMA treatment and obviously the introduction of psilocybin?
Yeah. So the first two journeys were just solid MDMA. I had a lot of physical trauma response that needed to be calmed down, to be talked through. Halfway through the integration, so my second journey was in December. So like around March of the following year, I had this nightmare about not being able to leave my childhood home. And long story short, and I was an English major, so I'm all about the imagery and the visualization. Like, it's one of the ways that my therapist and I work together. I could not visualize leaving my childhood home. That little girl at 5, like, the door that used to be in the house wasn't in the house. And after like literally months talking to my therapist about this, it was just the weirdest thing. And so my doctor said, if we reach this block, it's a pretty big block. If we reach this block in the journey, would you be open to having a little bit of psilocybin to see if we can get past this block? And I was like, I had never taken psilocybin before, but at this point, I completely trusted my doctors. And I'm like, yeah, fine. After I asked 10 million questions about what psilocybin and magic mushrooms were. And that's ultimately what happened. Halfway through that third journey, we could not, even under the influence of MDMA, the door to that house did not exist. And so my doctor gave me a very small dose of psilocybin. And within an hour, that was very visual. And by the end of that hour, my childhood home just kind of opened up like a big giant flower, just kind of like disappeared. And I suddenly found my little 5-year-old self in a garden. It was incredibly visual. It's called a hippie flip, where you have psilocybin with MDMA. It's not uncommon. It wasn't in the clinical trials, but in the underground here in the US, it's not uncommon, especially for large blocks like I have, or like I had. And I just have to really appreciate and thank my doctor and therapist for having the foresight to say, we might need to add something here, because this is clearly something really big in your subconscious to deal with.
Yeah, that's true. And like you say, go back to the clinical data. These are medical professionals that are advising you. If I go down to the doctor's tomorrow and I'm on mirtazapine just now, let's just say I go down and say, I'm feeling really crappy. I'm not getting back to the usual self. The always answer is going to be, well, increase your dose for a little bit, right? Just go up on the dose. You never get conventional advice, which again goes back to the confidence in the doctor's approach to give that advice. So again,
Very
it's just
much.
reinforcing the idea of how successful it is. So he said
Yeah.
this August that it's to become FDA approved. Could you just tell me
Yes.
what is potentially holding it up? I know there's going to be a lot of difference insurance-wise between the UK and America. And
Oof.
medicine, could you just talk a little bit about the story?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts, right? Okay. So Australia last year approved, and the way that the therapy works is that it's not like you just get a prescription. You go to a drugstore. We call them drugstores here. You get a drugstore and you get your prescription. You go home. That's not the way this works. This would be that same the way that I had to go to a place where my doctor and therapist were. You would have to go to a place, take the medicine under supervised conditions, because the therapist and the guide stay with you that entire time. And we can talk about insurance, because I think everybody right now is going, oh, cha-ching, that's going to be a little pricey. I've two doctors for 8 hours, so we can talk about that. So you need a facility that's going to be able to do that. What is happening in the US, 2017, our FDA that approves new drugs, they looked at this therapy, the first trial information, and they labeled this therapy with breakthrough designation. And what that means is that they couldn't see anything else on the market that worked as well. So the FDA has been working with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, but maps.org is really where you go. Don't type in that big giant name, maps.org. So the FDA has been working with MAPS since 2017. And so what's really interesting is that now the application is in front of the FDA. It got priority review, which means it gets reviewed in 6 months versus 9 to 12 months. And there's a line in the contract that says, if it's approved by the FDA, then our DEA, our drug enforcement folks, have 3 months to reschedule MDMA so that clinicians can go ahead and use it. Now, what has happened in the past 2 months is we've had 2 groups come out and say this should not be. We've had one group come out and say the data doesn't prove this works, insurance shouldn't cover it. It's a nonprofit group that said that. And then we just had an FDA advisory committee that clearly was not involved in any of the actual working with this medicine, because they had some of the most basic is this addictive? Like if they had looked at the information, they would know that that isn't the case. So we had an advisory committee basically say, you can't prove that MDMA without the therapy works, because they can't. It's MDMA psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And so this group said, well, you shouldn't approve because the FDA only has a purview over drugs. It doesn't have a purview over therapy. So what we have right now going on is this kind of juxtaposition between this brand new therapeutic modality and an approval process that doesn't match it. And so there's a little bit of give and take. There's a lot of people predicting doom and gloom because of these things. I tend to look at it and say, look, people are Monday morning quarterbacking. There's still so much stigma around psychedelics. I think the FDA working with MAPS since 2017, I would be really surprised if it didn't get approved. Because to be honest with you too, our veterans associations, they're like chomping at the bit. They have their own clinical trials, because we have so much to learn about different populations, and does group work better, and even dosage. Like we have so much to learn that if the FDA doesn't approve, it'll shut down that research. So like I'm pretty optimistic it's going to happen, but I'm not surprised that there's been this pushback, because the stigma with psychedelics is really strong. I'm sorry if that was boring, everybody, but that's what's going on.
No, I'm fascinated. I don't even need to wake up and look at my questions anymore. They're just coming naturally. So let's just say everything goes well and it gets FDA approval, the EAA, for the 3 months. Would that then be ever stay in America? Would be able to then, or then, because there's the same cannabis that there's federal laws versus. So just for us back home in the UK, and not to bore you, Could you just explain how that one works? Because we really don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So in our the way it, I was surprised to learn this too. I did not know this, that state, just because a particular pharmaceutical is FDA approved does not mean that a state has to offer it. So I can easily see there's going to be, and I don't want to irritate any of my US listeners, I won't call out some of the states I think will be problems, but I'll give an example of like California already has legislation out there that once this gets approved, they'll be able to offer it. There's some states on the Northeast that have already said as soon as it's approved, we're good. And in the US, we have a lot of ketamine clinics. Ketamine is a legal psychedelic here, and you have to go to the clinic for a ketamine treatment. And so I see a lot of ketamine clinics gearing up, trying to prepare their practitioners for an MDMA practice, but unfortunately it won't be available in every state yet, at least out the gate. Hopefully eventually it will be, once people understand how well it works.
And finally on that, do you believe that any of the current, your big pharmas could or would have a negative influence on the approval process? Obviously they have that power. They have 3 years. Do you hear anything from them in particular?
I agree with you. There certainly is a potential for groups or organizations that have a lot of money invested in SSRIs to say, we don't want this other healing modality. I can certainly see how that can happen. I'll be honest with you, I'm not paying that close attention to it because I can't control it. If that's what's happening, I can't control it. I do tend to think that if that is happening, it's not as big of a problem as just the general hesitancy around psychedelics, because the clinical evidence is there. So it's kind of hard to beat the clinical evidence, but it's real easy to rely on, that's a drug. What drugs are dangerous.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah. From that, it was going to be a question of mine in a couple of times, but we're kind of on the subject. Could you, you've then been through all the treatment, and if you describe yourself as obviously a cured of PTSD, what message could you give to maybe the older generation or anybody that is watching this or listening to this and thinking, no, drugs are bad.
Yeah.
What would your message be to them?
I would say, at one point we thought that women shouldn't have pockets in clothing because it would make them too independent. At some point, way back in the day when chalkboards were introduced and teachers were given the opportunity to use chalk on chalkboards, there were people who thought that was dangerous. So I think whenever you have something that's brand new, there's always going to be a little bit of resistance. In terms of psychedelic use, we've had years of propaganda against it for a whole lot of reasons. In the US, most of it was political, and we don't even have time to talk about that. And so what I would say to people right now who are maybe listening to this episode saying, oh my gosh, what? That's kind of crazy. What? If they know somebody who experiences PTSD, who has suicide ideology, or maybe anxiety, depression, just take a little bit of time to do an internet search about the clinical trial research with MDMA and PTSD, the clinical trial research with psilocybin or magic mushrooms and anxiety. Johns Hopkins over here is doing that. And you'll actually find at, I think it's called, I'm blanking, clinical trials, govtrials.com. It might be govtrials.com, but it'll show up on an internet search. You'll see a huge variety. I think there were over 100 trials or studies about MDMA at this point. So this is not new. It might be new to you. This is not new. And if you know someone who is suffering, or if you're suffering, it's a real easy, the easiest fruit to pick is literally just doing an internet search to find out what's going on, because this is not new to the researchers. And so that would be my advice. Just take a minute, do a little research to kind of say, maybe this is not what I thought it was or what I was told it was by the media for, the entirety of my life, for goodness sake.
Yeah, I mean, the way I'm kind of understanding it in my head is that it feels that the current the norm, the textbook way of treating anxiety, depression, PTSD. Like you said, the like diving farm or here. And this feels very much like you can put it into fifth gear and you can accelerate that treatment a lot faster. Is that something that you'd agree with?
I would say talk therapy is the horse and buggy on the 2-lane road, and MDMA therapy is the very nice, comfortable, safe car on a superhighway.
Yeah,
Hands down. Hands down.
Brilliant. Yeah, that was brilliantly way described. I think that's what I was trying to get. I just didn't quite get every time.
I got you. I
Thank
got
you
you.
so much.
I've been doing this longer.
I told you it'd be natural. So
Yep.
you went through your treatments, which was a major success, and so much of a success that inspired you to write books about it.
Yep.
Could you just talk a little bit, the journey of becoming an author and, teaching about this sort of this incredibly new but successful treatment course?
Yeah, I was an English major. I was an English teacher way back in the day, and I always kind of felt there was a book in me. So when I came out of that third journey, I was like, I'm going to write about this. It also didn't hurt that one of my integration methods is to journal. And so I had a year's worth of journals to kind of look back on and say, okay, what are the stories that really showed the healing? The memoir is, I tried to write the story about the therapy, and you can't write the story about the therapy without explaining how it works. And it works with child abuse in my case. So you really get a lot about my life and how it felt going through that year. Like, that year was not a fun year. There was a lot of tears, a lot of fear. I mean, I was basically almost healing a trauma memory one at a time. And so that's what the memoir does. The workbook, though, I went on a psychedelic tourism retreat way after my therapy, and I found that people were rather disappointed in their experiences. And it was because they hadn't done the work. They hadn't understood about intention setting. And so I wrote a workbook that mimics the 8 different ways my therapist and I came up with my intentions. And so that's out there for folks. And on my website, thejourneysage.com, you can actually get the body prompt, the prompt that we use the most. Like, what was your body telling you with the PTSD? What was your body saying? Everybody can have that prompt. It's a PDF download that, because I think that really helps people the most. And that's really it. It was just my teaching stuff. And then I started my YouTube channel because TEDx rejected my talk, because this therapy is not FDA approved. So they rejected a lot of men talking about psychedelics, but I didn't get approved. And so that kind of irritated me. And I started my own YouTube channel, basically creating the content that I wish had been around when I was going through the therapy. So if people are like, well, what really is this? Check it out on YouTube, because that's where I talk about it even more candidly.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And
Yeah.
just very Jonathan, all these links are going to be right in the episode description at the back. So if you are listening to this and you're thinking, shoot, I forgot that you rewind, don't pause. They're all going to be there at the very end of the episode. So you spoke there of how important intention setting is. Could you just describe again exactly what intention setting is?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that I like to say, and this is Jill's way of saying it, I like to say that the medicine highlights the memories that your intentions focus on. So, and I know that sounds kind of woo-woo-y. I wish I had a neurological way to explain it. You're just getting Jill's description. That my intentions going in were, why am I so scared? My adult life has been really pretty great. I've got a lot of security and safety. I've got plan A, plan B, plan C. I got plan Z at this point. Why do I not feel safe? And so my intentions were all about fear, figuring out why. And so what wound up happening is that during the integration, so I had my journey day. During that time, the medicine, MDMA in this instance, seemed to highlight different memories that the days, weeks, and even like a month or two after that MDMA journey, I was remembering childhood memories and looking at them. They were kind of like on a screen. They were like, so I wasn't scared. And I'm looking at like my 230-pound, 6'2" father beating a 3-year-old. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, There's no problem with that 3-year-old. There's a problem with that adult. And that reframing is the healing. And so the intention of why am I always so scared? Well, in some part of your brain, you still think you're that toddler that suddenly can get beaten up. And so that's kind of, it's the most I don't know, professional way to describe the MDMA highlights things in your brain, but that's how it feels.
Yeah. No, it must be. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. I've never experienced a therapy, but it sounds uplifting. I think is the word I would use to describe it, and life changing at that.
Yes, very much so.
Just for anybody that didn't catch that the earlier part, though, I will scoot back. Just some more questions again. You spoke about maps.org. Your own YouTube channel. You talk about where could we go though to get these definitive clinical trial data, the feedback. You know where I'm going with that. What are resources are available?
If you're specifically interested in MDMA, go over to maps.org and you'll see their MDMA for PTSD clinical trial data. All the research was written up in the Nature journal. So if you're searching, that'll also pop up. If you're that person who wants to actually read all the numbers and understand the PTSD scale and all that kind of stuff, that's way over my head. That's not a Jill thing. So I just go right to MAPS. That's the best way to see information about the specific trial. If you want to learn about additional clinical trials, MAPS is a great place to start. If you're a veteran from the US, if you're a veteran, go over to the VA because they are actively creating new clinical trials and they are recruiting. And then just in general, there are other pharmaceutical companies that are trying to develop a form of MDMA or maybe like a patch for like another way to take it. So I'm sure there's even clinical trials out there that I don't know about. It just comes down to doing a little bit of internet searching.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. I again like to thank you so much for coming on tonight. I always like to go towards the end of the episodes by giving the guests the floor once more. And giving a message out to anybody that is perhaps they know they suffer from PTSD, maybe they don't know they suffer from PTSD, but they maybe there's something going on behind them that they've aligned to depression or anxiety for years. And to anybody that this treatment may become available to, what would be your message to that?
My message would be get a realistic diagnosis first, because not all medicine is the same. Don't go take a hero dose journey of psilocybin when you're in a PTSD doom spiral, and you don't necessarily have somebody trained to sit with you. Treat psychedelics like you would treat any other medicine, and that medicine, you would not take a pain reliever just because you wouldn't take a pain reliever. I don't know. Because of hair loss. Make sure that you're taking a medicine that is actually aligned to the particular diagnosis. So that's the first step. Second step, do a lot of research. Psilocybin for depression has a lot of information out there, anxiety, that kind of thing. And then I would say too, if you're really, really serious, there is an underground. You can start doing some internet searches. You can start asking around and you'd be surprised at who you'd find. And I would just say at that point, really vet out who you're working with. Don't work with the kid who's had 3 mushroom trips and thinks that he can solve the world's problems. Make sure you're working with somebody with a therapeutic background or a long history of working with medicines therapeutically, because there's a lot of people underground who are doing this work.
And thank you for that. That was actually one more thing I was going to ask was about the hero dose. And that was one of my first questions. There would then be a misconception, I'm assuming, that I think it's Canada. There's a guy in Canada, I can't remember his name, but he swears by around 4 grams of mushrooms in a dark room for 12 hours by himself, and that sounds completely terrifying to me.
Right.
Just to be clear, that is not what we're advising on the sessions.
Absolutely not. Right. Would you jump into a 12-foot pool if you've never swam before?
Yep.
Jump into the 3 foot, do a smaller journey, understand what you're working with. There is no bragging rights here when it comes to your brains and psychedelics. So start small, understand what the medicines are, talk to a lot of people, and be really careful with people. If you ever hear like crazy stories of somebody who like wanted to jump off a roof or something and someone claims it was a psychedelic, first of all, find out what that person was on, find out how much the person took, find out any mental instability that was there before the medicine, because the medicine is not, no medicine will magically heal everything. If you come in with a bunch of pre-existing issues, so I'm always just very cautious with people. That's my experience. My doctors gave me a relatively low dose of MDMA, and then we had a booster when they saw that I was okay. I started in the pool at 3 feet and eventually made it my way over to the deeper end. So I really encourage that for folks. There's no reason to do a hero dose and scare yourself. And don't do a hero dose there is no hero dose with MDMA. You'll mess up your serotonin. You want to be very, 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 very precise with your MDMA dosage versus mushrooms. You can play around a little bit.
Yeah, I'm assuming if you're, serotonin syndrome would definitely become a factor with MDMA, I'm sure.
Right. Be very conservative. It's better to be conservative and learn than get yourself jammed up because you don't have a medical professional working with you.
That's very true. Jill, thank you so much again for, this has been really close to the past hour. I knew it was going to be a past hour. I knew it was going to be an episode that I really enjoyed doing as well, because I've learned a bunch as well. That's what I said to you before, that is, I was looking forward to this one as much as I hope that some of the listeners are going to be looking forward to when it gets published later on. So really, thank you for being so open and sharing your story and sharing what sounds like an incredibly successful route of treatment. And I'm so happy that it's worked for you. I mean, you are the living proof of it. So, honestly, thank you so much for coming on the Borderline podcast.
Andrew, thank you for having me. They were great questions. I really appreciate it.
No worries at all. Guys, I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. It's been a blast, and I'm positive you've all learned something new tonight. It's been a little bit out of the norm, but that is the way that we like to do things on the show, and we like to cover every approach to make sure that nobody is left questioning what else could we have done. And that is the importance of why we have conversations like that with me and Jill. So again, from Jill Sitnick across in the USA, from Andrew Willicks here tonight, this has been the Borderline Podcast. Good night.